Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and today I'd like to offer you a lecture, the 17th in a series that I'm doing and posting on the history of ethics. And this lecture will be on the debate over the utilitarian moral theory. And as always, I'd like to express my debt to the utilitarian moral philosopher James Rachels, whose text I used many years ago and whose basic structure for this lecture I have maintained, although over the decades I've put my own twist on it and put my own thoughts into it. But I'd like to recognize that in the way in which I too am standing on the shoulders of giants here in order to develop my own ideas, I think almost all of us are, and we should recognize that. So again, the goal for the lecture today is to look at the controversy and the criticisms and the defenses of the utilitarian theory, which we explored in the last lecture. This lecture will be in sort of three parts, and generally the three parts are sort of a characterization of utilitarianism, sort of some basic ideas of utilitarianism to get that back out on the table and put that into our minds. And then I will proceed to look at common criticisms of elements of the moral theory. And then I will explain defenses that utilitarians offer to these criticisms. And I will leave it up to you to decide who seems to win the argument and what you want to take or leave from utilitarian moral theory. Now, I've said I'm going to do this in three parts. It's going to be a little trickier than that. I'm going to give you kind of this overarching, simplified idea of utilitarianism first completely. Then I will go into a criticism of a part of that. Then I'll go into a defense against that criticism. Then I'll go into another criticism of a part of that, another part of that, and a defense, a criticism, and a defense in that way. And that's how I'm going to use these three elements of the position, the criticisms, and the defenses. I'm going to go through them in kind of an iterative, repeated fashion. And hopefully you'll see, once you've put enough time into it, why I've chosen to use this structure to explore these ideas. Okay, so let's start off with a really intuitive notion of utilitarianism that I shared in my last lecture on the moral theory, and that is the extent to which you're a good person is the extent to which you care about somebody's well-being besides your own. And the extent to which you care about somebody's well-being besides your own is the extent to which you exhibit moral utility, and hence the idea of utilitarianism. And this can really be boiled down to three basic claims. Here are sort of my version of what James Rachels would call the three basic claims of utilitarianism. He addresses it as classical utilitarianism, the utilitarianism associated with Bentham and Mill. I'm going to broaden it slightly and just say three basics of utilitarianism and sort of update one of his basics in a way that I think it makes it more broadly applicable in that way. Okay, so here they go. The first idea, right, that is required for utilitarianism is that in terms of good and bad in life, we have to go back to the hedonists in a way. Only positive and negative experiences matter in terms of good and bad evaluations of life. Okay, we could say this in a number of different ways. We could say only pleasures and pains matter in terms of good and bad in life. I think that's a little too simple, but that certainly echoes back to hedonism and should sound a little bit familiar if you know much about Jeremy Bentham. We could also say it like this: only happiness and unhappiness matter in terms of good and bad. I think that's actually how Rachels frames it in his writing on this topic. And that should, I think, echo the language of Mill. And I want to say it even more broadly than that. I want to say only positive and negative experiences on the part of creatures that are capable of such, i.e. sentient creatures, matter in terms of introducing something like good and bad into the world. Remember, we addressed this more subtly in an earlier lecture, and that is that if you combine sentience, like a number of different species, like a lot of species have, with conceptualization, like Homo sapiens have, then you get good and bad as concepts, right? Because you have to have this capacity to feel something that feels positive or negative, and then you have to have this capacity for conceptualization, and then you introduce good and bad into reality. And the reason why I wanted to go beyond Rachel's language here about only happiness and unhappiness matter is the same reason I want to go beyond classical utilitarianism. There are a number of utilitarians like J.J.C. Smart in the middle of the 20th century and Richard Hare in the middle of the 20th century and late 20th century, with whom I had the pleasure of studying briefly at Florida State University, who would argue that it's not about pleasure, it's not about pain, it's not about happiness, it's not about unhappiness, it's about something like preference satisfaction. And I think that's a wonderfully sort of neutral framework to use that addresses a lot of basic criticisms that are often put forth against utilitarianism, like the critique that Friedrich Nietzsche would offer when he somewhat sarcastically says, you know, not everybody, you know, loves happiness. Only British thinkers love happiness. And it's kind of famously sort of sarcastic little saying on the part of Nietzsche, who seems to be saying that the utilitarians don't value suffering enough in their philosophy, with their emphasis on promoting pleasure and promoting happiness. And so again, let's take that into consideration and let's broaden this. And I'll summarize here that only positive and negative experiences matter when it comes to the ideas of good and bad in life. And this I'm listing as sort of the first basic claim required to make sense of utilitarian moral theory. Only positive and negative experiences matter in terms of good and bad. Second idea, only consequences matter in terms of establishing moral right and wrong, in terms of actions. In terms of judging actions as right and wrong, only consequences matter. Now we could, let's go ahead and just spell this out, what's exactly being said here. If only consequences matter, you know, you might ask yourself the question, what doesn't matter? Well, it's an interesting list. One thing that doesn't matter, according to this idea, is motivation, something that was really crucial in Kantian ethics, for example. But again, don't be uncharitable to somebody like Mill. Mill makes sense of how we can factor intentions and motivations into an analysis of people's character. But in terms of judging actions as morally right and wrong, the utilitarians, it would seem like almost all of them want to keep it relatively simple and say, look, it's about the consequences. Motivations reflect on character. They're important in terms of an overarching discourse about morality, but more specifically about determining right from wrong, which is sort of one of the practical goals of a moral theory, is to help us distinguish right from wrong. It's simple. We look at consequences. So what else doesn't matter? Well, here's an interesting one. The action itself, considered somewhat intrinsically, is lying wrong? Is honesty right? Well, I think in some sense the utilitarian response is, and maybe you could anticipate this, it depends. You can't judge actions as morally right or wrong without considering consequences in terms of their impact on the general happiness, if I could use that phrase, or today to be a little bit more consistent, the consequences of actions on the positive and negative experiences of those that can have positive and negative experiences and that are impacted by the actions. So let me add one little fine tuning to this. In terms of what matters for, determining right from wrong, it's not motivation, it's not action, the actions themselves, it's consequences. And I'm going to add a word here, an adjective that's going to be important for us. It's foreseeable consequences. Because in some sense, hindsight is 20/20. We can always look backward at an action and decide, well, that turned out badly and produced a lot of harm. I guess that was wrong of you. In some sense, I think that's a little uncharitable, right? Because if we engage in an action, let's say a small lie or something like that, in order to protect somebody's feelings, And we're doing it because we think in that moment that the foreseeable consequences of honesty are detrimental or bad for experience, and the foreseeable consequences of this small lie is good for experience. If after the fact it turns out to have done more harm than good, it's not really fair to go back and retroactively call that action wrong. What we have to do, and this sort of highlights our epistemic predicament, our predicament with regard to our knowledge about morality. As when we make our moral judgments in life, we don't have a perfect understanding of the consequences that will result. So this one word adds a lot. What we're really concerned with in terms of trying to decide right from wrong are the foreseeable consequences. Now let's highlight that this idea of foreseeable consequences then introduces almost a kind of an implicit moral duty, and that is that we try to think hard about the likely consequences of our actions. To the extent that we are moral, right, we're concerned with how our actions impact all those impacted. And if we are just like willingly negligent with regard to not seeing the likely consequences, that's a failing, morally speaking. So again, in summary, our first claim was that only positive and negative experiences matter in determining good and bad. Our second claim is only foreseeable consequences matter in determining right and wrong. And then our third basic element to sort of build the three legs of the stool that we might think of as utilitarian moral theory is often stated as each person counts for one. Each person counts equally. Okay, from a moral standpoint, each person counts equally. Now, again, psychologically, emotionally, I think we're built in such a way that we have a very strong tendency to be concerned with ourselves and our loved ones first and foremost. You know, maybe it's something like this: self and loved ones, although, you know, once you become a parent, sometimes it's like loved ones and then self and then friends and then acquaintances and then strangers. And this is the way we sort of build out an understanding of the scopes of concern based on the typical functions of psychology and our emotion. However, from a moral standpoint, there's a tension between morality and our typical psychological standpoint here. And this is, we're going to have to come back to this as we engage in this debate about utilitarianism later in the lecture. But if each person counts for one, then, you know, a stranger on the other side of the planet from a different society that I don't know at all and I'm not related to matters as much as my loved one right here next to me. Again, I'm not making a psychological claim because that's just, that would be foolish. We most of us would value the loved one in proximity to us. You know, combine those two factors, proximity plus love, you know, equals more psychological concern. But from a moral standpoint, it seems like we do have to consider the possibility, right? And I think this is built into utilitarianism and hence one of these three basic claims, that everybody counts. From a moral standpoint, if you live your life in such a way that only you and your loved ones matter and you don't care what happens to other people as you and your loved ones flourish, well, you know, there's morally, in a lot of scenarios, going to be obvious problems with that, let's say. Now, of course, so far, I've described this as each person counts for one. I think that might be the phrasing of James Rachel's in his original writing on this topic. I'd like to change that to complicate things, but complicate things in a way that I think is realistic and true to utilitarianism. And that is that the third element here would be not each person counts for one, but each sentient being counts. Remember that utilitarianism was explicitly expanding the scope of moral concern for the first time in history in some respects with their theoretical framework beyond the realm of the human. You know, as Bentham said, you know, I think I've paraphrased this off and on for you in my last lecture as, you know, the question is not whether you can talk and whether you can reason, it's whether you can feel. I think Bentham actually says whether you can suffer. Because if you can suffer, you can be done wrong too. And, you know, in many ways, we get this. I mean, unless you are, you know, sociopathic, or unless, you know, you've had some things in life just sort of beat you to a place of rage and anger, almost all of us get, you know, look, if we see a non-human animal suffering, you know, we don't laugh, we don't take joy in that. We are rightly disturbed by that. If we see a person causing the completely unnecessary extreme suffering of a non-human animal, you know, we're rightly troubled by that. And this is not just a psychological claim. I think for utilitarians, this is a moral claim. We should be troubled by that. And the utilitarians, I think Hume, with his idea of empathy or disinterested sentiment, has a way to make sense of this. But, you know, Kant doesn't, and the social contractarians don't amongst the modern thinkers. The utilitarians explicitly are willing to complicate morality in a way that I think matters, in a way that deals with that one major, you know, major problem of social contract theory, and that is that most social contractarians cannot explain why it's wrong to knowingly harm sentient creatures that are not capable of entering into a social contract with us. The utilitarian wants to just assert that it is. And again, admitting that there's no proof of this, but this is an attempt to generate a plausible and reasonable account of morality and then think through the implications of this so that what? So that we can become more thoughtful moral beings. Also, importantly, so that we have a framework within which we could generate some kind of constructive dialogue over our moral issues. You know, keep in mind that a lot of contemporary moral issues, some of which we'll talk about in the lecture here, are issues where people just talk right past each other. And one of the reasons for it, besides human stubbornness and, you know, the challenges psychologically of listening to views that we don't agree with and being overly identified with our current views and beliefs, one of the reasons why people talk right past each other is they don't share a moral framework. And, you know, one person's talking natural law or divine command, and another person's talking utilitarianism. And they're, you know, it's no surprise that they're never going to have constructive moral debate, because we have to at least find a little common ground to inhabit in order to generate more constructive debate. And so the utilitarians are trying to solve a very important practical problem with a reasonable and plausible account of morality. And here to start today, I've kind of boiled it down to 3 claims. And I'll review them here so we can get them into our heads, and then we'll launch off into some of the criticisms and defenses. Only positive and negative experiences matter with regard to good and bad. Only foreseeable consequences matter with regard to right and wrong in a moral sense. And each sentient being counts. And notice when I first framed that third one, I said each human being, each person counts for one. Here, each sentient being counts. How much should we count the suffering of a chicken against the suffering of a human? You know, clearly we are muddying the waters of the hedonic calculus here. It is a very difficult theoretical issue to solve. I'm not going to try to solve it today. I'm going to leave you with the intuitive messiness of it, and that is that it should matter to you if you call yourself moral, especially from a utilitarian standpoint. If you think you're concerned with the greatest happiness for the greatest number, if you buy it at all, right, then the torturing of an animal, even a chicken, right, should matter to you. And, you know, the way this is going to get messy, right, is that if we raise chickens, let's say, which I think may be like the most common bird on the planet at this point in history because of the way humans eat so many chickens, if what matters most in the way we raise chickens is profit, which happens in factory farming, industrialized, complex economies like our own that tend to be capitalistic, there's kind of this ethical neutrality is the nice way to say it, often maybe kind of ethical apathy in capitalist economic systems, where if it's about profit, the invisible hand doesn't often do a very good job of bringing morality into the picture. You can say, well, people will vote with their dollars, but when you put those 10,000 chickens in a building far away, humans have a very easy time forgetting what's going on in there and how many of them are just dying day in, day out, and how they've been treated in the course of their lifetime. As long as their little flesh makes it to the market for a cheap cost, we tend to sort of be willing to look the other way. In a way we wouldn't, right? If we were simply confronted right here, right now, with some animal, even a bird, being just tortured for no reason, we would probably get involved in that situation if it were put in our face. But let's just admit it, a lot of us have a pretty easy time turning our attention away from the implications morally of each sentient being counts. And again, I'm going to leave that messy. How much do they count? It's difficult to say. How many little white mice should give up their lives in order to solve cancer? That's an incredibly difficult question, morally speaking. I would say that lives in a gray area for sure. There are those who would argue that, humans have no moral right to use other species and cause them suffering to lessen the suffering of humans. There are others who would say, at another extreme that sounds, I think, completely inconsistent with utilitarianism, and that is, what does it matter at all? And in that position, you tend to also see, well, frankly, if I can just make a better, cheaper hairspray, by spraying it in the eyes of bunnies, then okay, what do bunnies matter, because they're not humans? Again, remember, the utilitarian clearly is going to say sentient beings matter. How much do they matter? Well, at the very least, we can begin to say, well, when it comes to developing, a better treatment for male pattern baldness or a better cosmetic, maybe we should begin to minimize the way in which we knowingly cause suffering on these other creatures. When it comes to solving, something like cancer, which does itself cause a tremendous amount of suffering, it becomes a much more difficult calculus. But I want to stick here with the more intuitive point. By the way, I think that this already kind of gets us into the debate about utilitarianism and how it might be valuable and how it might be disturbing, might be one way to put it, upsetting for the way that we live our lives and the things we turn away from in our society here. But I want to stick with the kind of obvious, I hope obvious and intuitive point that sentient beings should matter. And certainly from a utilitarian framework, only positive and negative experiences matter in terms of good and bad. Only foreseeable consequences matter in terms of right and wrong. And each sentient being somehow should count in the overarching weighing that we're doing to establish how to choose morally and how to live our lives morally. Okay, so now let's talk about the fact that this framework is very commonly defended and very commonly attacked. And so we want to explore today the debate about utilitarianism. And again, my strategy is to talk about some common or famous attacks or criticisms, and then offer you some of the utilitarian defenses, and for you to decide, whether this is a useful idea or not. Okay, so let's start with what I would regard as some of the easiest criticisms for the utilitarian to respond to. And some of these center around an attack on the first of these three elements, namely the idea that only positive and negative experiences matter when establishing good and bad in life. Okay, and so the common strategy of a critic is often to do some kind of reductio ad absurdum argument, or more specifically, some kind of counterexample argument, which describes a scenario in which you take the idea from the position under consideration and you sort of think about the implications of this position in a certain scenario. And if in this scenario the position leads to, again, kind of an absurd kind of conclusion, then we have an argument against the position. I've laid out the position. It's utilitarianism. The position is comprised of these three basic claims. And now I'm going to begin to attack the first basic claim that only positive and negative experiences matter when determining good and bad. And one common counterexample that has been put forth describes a situation, again, I'll give it somewhat of my own spin, in which there's a famous or perhaps a young up-and-coming musician, let's say a young woman who plays piano, and she has an accident in which she has severe damage to, let's say, her hands and her nervous system in such a way that she will never play piano again. But in the course of her recovery from her many surgeries related to her accident, she discovers a love of watching professional wrestling on television. And let's say you know this person and you visit this person while she's recovering, and you find her watching professional wrestling, and you haven't been around, but you come and you say, look, I haven't had the chance to see you, but I'm really so sorry about your accident and all that has resulted from your accident. And she looks at you with a big smile on her face and says, don't be, I would have never discovered wrestling and my love of wrestling had this whole thing not happened. I'm happier now than I ever was before. Okay, pause right there. Here is the counterexample. Let's spell out why it's a counterexample if it's not obvious. By the standard that the utilitarian embraces, that only positive and negative experiences matter for good and bad, we seem to be forced into a kind of a corner here by the critics scenario. We seem to be forced to this absurd conclusion that the accident wasn't bad because she's reporting being happier than ever before. Okay. Are we, in fact, forced into that conclusion? Okay, now I want to shift here from the counterexample and the criticism, and I hope I'm doing it justice. I'm trying. I've wondered if I'm doing some kind of straw man here move unconsciously, because Rachel's responds to this differently than I will, but let's look at the way in which a utilitarian might respond or try to defend this leg of the three-legged stool here, this one basic assumption that only positive and negative experiences matter in determining good and bad. And the first line of defense for the utilitarian is to challenge the counterexample with a kind of a more thorough analysis of the situation. And so, you know, the situation again is we've had this pianist who has had an accident and she's discovered a love of wrestling. And when you now meet her, she says she's happier than ever before. And are we forced to accept the absurd conclusion that what happened to her was a good thing by this standard that only positive and negative experiences matter? She's happier than ever, so I guess this was good. Okay, how might the utilitarian respond? Well, I think there's a number of available responses here. One is to say, I'm not sure I believe this friend of mine, that she's happier than ever. I think that I'm glad that in this moment, she's got something to distract her from the long, difficult road of physical therapy. But I'm a little worried that she's not yet come to full grips with, you know, what has happened to her in her life. Her identity was music. She will no longer play music with her hands again. I think that there's a lot of foreseeable suffering in her future that would help us to understand why this is still a tragic scenario. Let's also add that I somewhat purposefully kind of glossed over the obvious pains associated with the accident itself and the surgeries and the physical therapy that's required. This is part of the badness of the situation here. And so now we're beginning to use the idea that positive and negative experiences matter in terms of, and they're all that matter in determining good and bad. by saying, look, this is still a bad situation. We're not forced to admit that call this good. It's bad for a couple of reasons. There's the original pain of the accident and the immediate after effects and the surgeries and the recoveries and the physical therapy. And now let's add that there's this probability that she's still in some kind of shock and is not dealing with the long-term emotional, psychological, and intellectual challenges, not to mention physical challenges of learning to do things in her life for herself without the use of her hands and the way her nervous system has been affected. And then let's add yet one more layer here, and that is that, you know, watching her watch wrestling, you know, brings a smile to my face in this moment that she's joyful, but it's nothing compared to what I used to experience when I watched her and listened to her play piano. Part of the tragedy of this accident and badness of this situation is not just her physical pain, not just her emotional and psychological trauma and the losses that she's yet to confront. It's the loss of the joy that she would have brought to thousands over the course of her lifetime had she continued to play. In terms of foreseeable outcomes here, this is part of what explains the tragic nature of the accident from a utilitarian standpoint. And so in some sense, I see the utilitarian as being able to offer a pretty good response to this counterexample. There is another example discussed in my lecture notes that has a very similar kind of way of playing out. I'm going to hint at it and not go into it as great a detail, but imagine that you have a friend who is really talking badly about you behind your back. If you don't know about your backstabbing friend, it's not causing you unhappiness, so are you forced by the utilitarian standard to admit that nothing bad is happening? And I think in some sense, the critic is trying to say, well, look, this disloyalty is morally troublesome, and this situation is bad, even though you don't know about it yet. And so there's no positive or negative experiences that have manifested for you yet. Again, I'll just hint at the way in which I think that the utilitarian could defend the idea of utilitarianism here, the first of the three legs of the stool here, by challenging the counterexample and saying, look, okay, remember we're dealing with foreseeable consequences. How long is this backstabbing supposed to go on before you do find out? Okay, you can stipulate with the counterexample that you never do, and maybe there are scenarios where people never do. Let's talk about both. It's likely that you will if it goes on long enough, and that betrayal is going to hurt, and that's why betrayal is bad, the utilitarian would say. And then let's add that, you know, even if you don't find out about it, you're going to maybe lose some friends or some relationships because of the way this person is able to talk badly about you behind your back, you know, over time. And so there is harm, and whether you know it or what the cause of the harm, or whether you know what the cause of the harm is or not, there's a sense in which we can understand, using the ideas of utilitarianism, why the backstabbing, why the disloyalty is a bad thing. It's a harmful thing, right? Okay, again, there's even other ones, maybe talking about like a peeping Tom or something like that. And if you don't know about the peeping Tom, are you forced to somehow be neutral with regard to the badness or immorality even of the peeping Tom's activities? I think you can handle thinking through that kind of counterexample in the way that we've thought through these two on your own. So these were counterexamples used to attack the claim that only positive and negative experiences matter with regard to good and bad. I have to admit, I'm pretty sympathetic to the utilitarian on this point. I hope that doesn't make me somehow miss something obvious with regard to how powerful these counterexamples might be. If you're interested in this, you could look up James Rachel's own writings on the matter. I think he does take this in a slightly different direction in his work, The Elements of Moral Philosophy, and in his chapter there, aptly named the debate, if I recall, the debate about utilitarianism, which I'm borrowing structure from here heavily. But again, sort of putting my own my own spin on it. And again, let's be clear about something here and the goal of these lectures. I'm not here trying to convince you to think like I think, not in terms of agreeing with my conclusions. My goal here is to invite you to a more examined life by thinking through some difficult issues in the field of ethics and inviting you to try to become a more thoughtful person with regard to your own moral beliefs. And if I'm just kind of honest about, some of my deeper motivation here, I do have a kind of a deep down assumption, might even call it a leap of faith here, and that is that if more of us were to engage in more examined lives in that Socratic sense, if more of us were to accept that Socratic challenge and live more philosophically awakened lives with regard to ethics and morality, then we would probably create a more moral society. That's part of one of my working assumptions here, which may or may not be right. I also happen to think that we would make democracy itself more interesting if we were all more philosophically awakened and less susceptible to easy sophistry, and a little bit more humble in the way that we reach some of the views that we reach, and then often sort of simply project those onto others with our judgments of others. I think that maybe we are not humble enough sometimes because we don't often think through the complexities of the situations and see the value of arguments on both sides here. And so that's sort of ultimately my goal here in these lectures, and particularly in this lecture series when I got to the modern age. I would say particularly starting with social contract theory, and certainly by the time you got to my lecture, if you've been following the series on Hume, some students report sort of running into a bit of a buzzsaw, particularly in that lecture on Hume, because I'm starting to really ramp up my expectations for you in terms of following a complex line of thought for an extended period of time with some level of philosophical rigor in terms of the argumentation that's being offered and engagement in the back and forth, right? The intellectual challenge of having to inhabit multiple positions within a debate is a crucial muscle, right, for us to develop. And we're working on that right now in this lecture on the debate over utilitarianism. So I'm not trying to get you to think or to sort of agree with my conclusions. Oftentimes I leave, inspired by Socrates, I try to leave the conclusions sort of open-ended, but I'm inviting you into the nuance and the complexity and the gray area in order to invite you into a more examined life. And so now I want to, let me, stop, giving you my motivation for the lecture and get back into the lecture itself. Let's get back to criticisms of the second of the three basic claims of utilitarianism. Again, if we were doing this in a classroom, I would have, and if I were, more technologically able, right, I could flash this up on the screen in front of you. I think there's some value, frankly, to having to juggle these ideas in your mind. It's really kind of a muscle, right, of abstraction to be able to sort of juggle ideas in your mind over time. But I'll use a lot of review here to help, and forgive me if that seems repetitious or redundant. But the three basic claims: only positive and negative experiences matter in terms of good and bad, and only foreseeable consequences matter for right and wrong, and each sentient being counts. I'm now going to focus my attention on criticisms of the second claim, that only foreseeable consequences matter for right and wrong. And remember, in some sense, I see myself as building towards tougher and tougher criticisms here. So there have been a lot of criticisms of this really kind of essential utilitarian idea that only consequences matter. And the criticisms are very powerful, although I'll have to say, I think that they sound very powerful at first. I'm going to do my best to make them sound very powerful by plausibly, not using sophistry, giving these counterexamples and criticisms, but then I'm also going to try my best charitably to give the defense of the utilitarian theory, and then just sort of lay that out there for you to consider. Okay, so one attack on the idea that only consequences matter in determining right and wrong could be expressed very simply as, something like, really? What about justice? Does that not matter? Okay. I'm giving that in the form of an almost sarcastic rhetorical question, but I want it to sound very human and relatable. The idea here is, let's look at this a little bit more carefully and less in terms of a rhetorical question. I'm going to shoot myself in the foot and contradict myself here. I'm going to ask you a question I genuinely want you to try to think of in terms of answering. Would justice matter to a utilitarian? And I just, again, paused, and you can always pause lecture, right, to think about some things, which, by the way, is a great idea. Pause lecture to think about some things every once in a while, right? But what do you think? Does justice matter to a utilitarian? Well, I think one very plausible answer to that is it depends. Because remember, when we say that only consequences matter, or only foreseeable consequences matter in determining right from wrong, one of the things we've committed to here is that we cannot judge actions, even just actions, in and of themselves without some analysis of the foreseeable consequences of those actions in a specific circumstance. So if you ask the utilitarian, does justice matter? The answer is it depends, and that is already a partial victory, I would say, on the part of the critic, at least in terms of rhetoric, right? Because justice and fairness is very intuitive to most of us. And if you can get the utilitarian to admit right off the bat with a simple question, does justice matter, to admit that maybe it does, well, the implication is sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. And if justice is as intuitive an idea culturally and psychologically, and maybe even, I would argue, we have good reason to believe, kind of biologically, its fairness is kind of hardwired into us. I'm going to resist going in too deeply into the research that would justify that. But it's a very intuitive idea. And let me say that another way. Justice is something almost all of us think matters. Right? And many of us think matters in a kind of an absolute way, that from a moral perspective, fairness, and I'm thinking of justice not in the Platonic sense of justice as inner harmony, but justice in kind of a broad sense as fairness. Fairness should matter. And a moral theory that doesn't say yes to this question of does justice matter is problematized. Okay. Well, partial victory already, but let's not let the utilitarian off the hook that easily. Let's borrow again from Rachel's a kind of a scenario that I think he borrows actually from other writers in the 1960s, a kind of a scenario, kind of a case, a counterexample, where we're going to make utilitarianism look very bad by describing an unfortunately real world kind of example. Okay, so, and this builds on this intuition that justice should matter to us as a criticism of the utilitarian theory. Imagine a scenario which is all too timely. I feel almost uncomfortable at the same time as inspired to speak about this kind of example in this moment, because I know that it'll be fraught with strong feeling. But let's go back to an example that was raised in the 1960s as a criticism of utilitarianism. And it was ripped from, unfortunately, kind of fictionalized kind of headline, like a sort of a, what are these all these crime shows, right? Like Law and Order that take things that are real and kind of fictionalize them. That's what's happening in this counterexample. And so imagine a small town in the rural southern United States in the 1960s. Imagine a scenario in which a white woman reports being raped by a black man, and imagine the foreseeable consequences of that scenario, right? And so as this might play out, maybe a group of self-appointed white citizens will don white sheets and go across the tracks to the segregated black community with torches and ropes in order to exact what would have passed for, at that time, through the lens of the white supremacist society at that time, some kind of justice, right? The report of a white woman having been raped by a black man would have brought the Ku Klux Klan or the self-appointed moral police out of the woodwork, and frankly, they wouldn't have had to hide, right? In the 1960s, this all would have been very explicit, and they would have shown up, right, on the at the edge of the, let's call it, black community, which would have been segregated in that time frame of the United States, with torches and ropes, ready to, and I'm gonna use this phrase purposefully, ironically, exact some justice here. Now, let's say you are a utilitarian on the edge of this scenario, and that you're not caught up in the racism of this moment, and you are not going to be victimized in this moment, that you inhabit this sort of fictionalized moral position where you could perhaps intervene. And what should you do? And if you're a utilitarian, specifically, what should you do? Should you consider the possibility that the right thing to do in this moment would be to frame an innocent black man for this alleged rape? Now, again, it's a terrible scenario, and it's really painful to think about, but there's a point to this thought experiment here. And a lot, frankly, could be brought out by this experiment, if in this thought experiment, if you could think it through. Should you, from a utilitarian standpoint, looking at foreseeable consequences, do you have cause to try to frame one person if you think that what's about to happen is a bunch of people are about to be killed and some people are going to get lynched? And if you want to disturb yourself in a kind of a very real, and I would say almost morally obligatory way, look up how many times human beings strung other human beings up from a tree or whatever by a rope in the United States of America in the 20th century. If you want to be surprised and upset, look at that history. And in this moment, I would say, we almost have an obligation to understand that history in the way that we have so, let's admit it, imperfectly embodied the ideals of our nation. Okay, again, imagine yourself the utilitarian on the edge of the scenario. Now, should you consider that the right thing to do is to frame an innocent black man for the wrath of this racist mob? Now, that is disturbing. But I think that at some level, the utilitarian answer has to be something like, maybe. And again, I think partial victory already for the critic, right? Because if this maybe, right, is problematic, and I think it is, right, from a moral standpoint, especially in terms of common intuitions, but stay with the argument a little longer here, right? Okay, maybe it's the right thing to do to frame an innocent person if you really think it's likely that more than one innocent person might die today. Okay, that is a pretty powerful victory for the critic in sort of throwing some maybe very, some powerful arguments against the utilitarian basic assumption that only foreseeable consequences matter. And so in this case, the unfairness of that situation, the obvious unfairness of that situation wouldn't trump all other concerns. Okay, now, there's going to be a kind of a first layer of defense now for the utilitarian, and that is to challenge the counterexample by thinking it through more thoroughly and thinking through if we've neglected any of its implications here, or particularly any of the foreseeable consequences here. Let's consider the possibility, right, that there could be some incredibly negative foreseeable consequences to framing an innocent person, even if your goal is to save more innocent persons, right? Like that's why the utilitarian had to say, maybe, if it's possible that you could save more lives and minimize the suffering and violence, racialized violence of this moment by sacrificing one scapegoat in this moment, maybe, you know, the utilitarian needs to sort of bite the bullet and say, yeah, maybe it's the right thing to do. But let's push back from a utilitarian perspective and say, but it's not obvious it's the right thing to do, even from a utilitarian framework. Can you imagine foreseeable consequences that are negative that would result from framing this innocent person, besides the death of that innocent person? Because remember, that was about minimizing death and violence already. Well, consider another foreseeable consequence, negative consequence in terms of negative experiences that might result from framing an innocent person for an alleged rape. And I'll let you think about it for a second. You know, what if the rape is real? You know, we don't know yet who did it, but if the rape is real, if we in this moment, you know, retroactively, you know, take the woman's seriously, right? You know, and consider the assault charge and let's look at it seriously. Here's a potentially huge negative impact of framing an innocent person. We stop looking for a rapist. And if you stop looking for a rapist, well, what are the chances here? I don't think you need to have a background in criminology to know that, you know, and again, forgive me because I am being very amateur here in my criminological data. I need to look this up and perhaps you can correct me. But I'm going to assume that in many cases of assault, that this is not something that somebody does one time. And if you stop looking for a rapist, what you set yourself up for is a rape. Another rape down the line, another accusation, possibly being in the same scenario 6 months later, however long later. Nothing gained from having framed an innocent person. So you need to look at other options in terms of what would be the right thing to do to intercede in this moment of racialized violence. Okay, again, messy scenario, partial victory for the critic, maybe somewhat of a successful pushback for the utilitarian. And so let me offer you what James Rachels would call kind of a second line of defense for the utilitarian. One which I'm going to say Rachels himself is not fond of, and many utilitarians are not fond of. And maybe I just need to go to school on this a little bit more, but I actually happen to be a little sympathetic to if I'm trying to defend utilitarianism. And so again, to put this into context, what I'm doing now is I'm going to say, look, the critic has offered this scenario in which justice is potentially being violated by looking at the world through utilitarian lens. That's already problematic. And then the utilitarian pushes back a little bit by challenging the scenario and saying, well, maybe justice is being challenged, maybe it's not. Okay. But that's, again, the best we got so far is maybe it is, maybe it isn't. That's already problematic for the utilitarians. So let's add another potential line of defense for the theory against this kind of attack. And in a phrase, we could say that the defense being offered, that's potentially offered here, would be called rule utilitarianism. So let me introduce you to this idea of a contrast between what's known as act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Sounds complex. It's really not that complex an idea. Act utilitarianism uses something like the principle of utility or the greatest happiness for the greatest number to decide which actions are right or wrong. According to this notion of rule utilitarianism, we should use the principle of utility or the greatest happiness for the greatest number to thoughtfully generate a body of rules which we could then follow, which would have a good chance of maximizing happiness in society. Okay, here, you know, a lot of utilitarians don't like this, and I'm going to pull from the work of 1961 or so, J.G.C. Smart. I think, is one of these folks who criticizes real utilitarianism in this way. He says, look, what kind of utilitarian would create a body of rules to follow where sometimes following the rules in a specific scenario would actually lead to less happiness? That in some sense, if you stay true to utilitarianism, you'd never follow all the rules, and this is going to collapse back into ACT utilitarianism. Okay, by the way, this is a little bit of a tangent, and it's kind of a sophisticated one about moral theory. Some of you are going to follow it. Some of you are going to be a little bit more fuzzy. It's okay. I'll get back to the main point here of defending utilitarianism against this counterexample. But for those of you following this slightly more sophisticated debate about theory here, what I'm developing for you, and multiple reasons here, as I want you to get a little familiar with this idea of real utilitarianism, because I'm going to use it to defend the theory, is look, maybe we create a body of rules that has the chance of maximizing happiness. Now, again, even some utilitarians, I would say most, find this problematic, because it's like, let's say you, and here's where this is going, right? Like, let's say you develop some rules about being fair. Why? Because being fair leads to greater happiness in general. Well, what kind of utilitarian is going to be fair in a specific scenario where being unfair would lead to greater happiness? Now, here's my kind of workaround for that in order to make real utilitarianism sound a little bit more plausible. Why don't we just add one more rule, and that is a rule about exceptions. We got general rules of thumb here that we follow in most cases, but when we want to break them, we have a tougher argument to make, which is why the greatest happiness is so obviously served in this case that we should break our general rule, let's say, about being fair. Now, how does this apply to what we were talking about a moment ago? Well, consider that what the critic wants to do is beat up the theory of utilitarianism with a certain stick, and that stick is justice. And justice is a very effective stick to hit the theory with. Why? Because most of us are really into this idea of justice. And I've argued, we've been culturally conditioned into thinking fairness matters morally. It is, I think, psychologically just kind of very appealing for those of us who have any level of objectivity. It may even be biologically hardwired into us to be concerned with some level of fairness. For social cooperative mammals, there's some good evidence that a level of fairness is just sort of almost instinctual. But the question here is, why should justice matter? Just because we think it does? Just because it feels intuitively plausible? Is that the best we can do to justify justice, to explain why justice matters? And here's where rule utilitarianism becomes a little bit interesting, especially in a modern debate about morality. What is justice, this stick that the critic is using to beat the theory of utilitarianism with, besides just an intuition, maybe even one grounded in kind of an instinctual level? Do we imagine that somehow this intuition translates to some metaphysical insight about the nature of reality that is expressed in something like karma? Right? Does somebody who does something wrong need to be punished in order to sort of restore the balance in reality of moral justice? Right? Is there something just wrong about treating somebody unfairly, and it upsets something in the nature of reality itself about fairness? Well, look, that language is going to sound, on the one hand, psychologically, emotionally, and linguistically familiar, but from a modern crisis in ethics context, that language should sound metaphysically suspect. because what we don't see, besides evidence for the intuitive nature of justice, is the reality of justice. And this is just a fancy way to talk again about this point that I'm using a lot of repetition here to get you guys to think about deep points in ethics, is that there's no knowable moral fact of the matter so far about justice. Why does fairness matter? We need an argument. And guess what? Rule utilitarians can offer us at least a modern argument. Because if you will at least accept as an assumption that the goal of society is to create the best life possible for the most people, then we would have a very strong argument for why basic rules of fairness should be a part of our society. We would have an argument for a rule that is justified by the principle of utility. Now, I'm hoping you've worked hard, you've maybe listened to this multiple times, you can see the genius of this defense. I call it kind of a philosophical jiu-jitsu move, right? Because the strength of the criticism was in the plausibility and intuitiveness of the idea of justice. So you beat the theory up with justice and some scenario like this case of racial violence that really pulls out our strong sense of how unfair and unjust this situation is. And we beat up the theory with this feeling of unfairness. But now the utilitarian pushes you back to a draw in this sort of battle where you say, maybe we should be unfair in this scenario, maybe we shouldn't. A still partial victory, I would say, for the critic. But now in this final move of philosophical jiu-jitsu, the utilitarian takes the strength of the criticism, which is the idea of justice and how intuitive that is, and says, actually, you need something like my theory and the principle of utility and the foreseeable consequences of acting as if justice matters to explain why justice matters. Why is justice so important from a moral perspective, if not because of the consequences, the good consequences that most always result from acting as if fairness is a rule of morality we should all follow? You know, let me try to make this even more sort of simple as an argument. I hope I don't weaken the position too much with the simplicity of this argument, but ask yourself kind of a simple rhetorical question. Where would you rather live? A society that is unfair and sort of unpredictable in that way, and where sometimes the guilty are punished and sometimes the innocent are punished, and we don't even try to just punish the guilty? It's just like luck. Would you rather live there, or would you rather live in a society that at least tries, as imperfectly as we do, to punish the guilty? I know there's all kinds of ironies in here and me mixing the racial lens and this discussion of punishing the guilty, but just stick with the simplicity point here, the simple point here. Where would you rather live? A society that at least tries, or a society that makes it a flip of a coin? And, you know, I think the answer, right, is kind of, it's almost a rhetorical question. Of course, we would rather live in a society that at least tries, and better than that, you know, tries really hard, right? Well, why? You know, your answer might be the fairly unsophisticated, because fairness is just right. But my point I'm trying to make here in a modern ethical context moment is, well, you know, it's one thing to say fairness is right and to teach children it's just right. But when you become an adult, the deeper question is, well, why is it right? And one plausible answer is it's right because it's right to the extent that it has a tendency to promote the happiness and well-being of the participants in a society that embraces fairness. So again, let me summarize. The utilitarian uses this incredible, I would say, philosophical jiu-jitsu move where the very strength of the stick, the impressiveness of the stick called justice that you use as a critic to beat utilitarianism with, the very strength of that stick, the impressiveness of that stick that you beat the theory with, is actually something that might require the theory to justify its impressiveness. Now, again, those of you who are following in this lecture series, I want to start to stand up on some kind of, let me make a kind of a sophisticated point here. When you not only follow a particular lecture for an hour or two, that's impressive enough. When you follow a series of lectures and a line of thought or read a whole book or something like that, you get to start to stand up on top of a body of ideas, whether those ideas are right or wrong, in order to have a much more sophisticated and nuanced conversation. And in this case, a more sophisticated and nuanced bit of ethical discourse. So let me just say that while I'm listing this as a kind of a defense of utilitarianism, let's go ahead and just add this, frankly, could be a defense of social contract theory as well, right? Like, why does justice matter? I think the social contract theory, the social contractarian or the social contract theorist has an interesting answer to that as well. But here I'm trying to make the point in defense of utilitarianism that one very plausible answer in the context of the modern crisis of ethics is that you cannot prove justice matters by appealing to moral facts, but you can make an argument that justice matters by appealing to the utility of that idea. Now, this is one iteration of really complex back and forth that I think would actually serve us really well, because the next two examples that I want to offer that attack the idea of utilitarianism that only foreseeable consequences matter in terms of right and wrong, the next two examples as attacks and in terms of defenses have the exact same sort of structure in terms of the way the argument or the debate plays out. So we've spent a long time developing the first one so that you have the chance to sort of see with greater clarity a couple of other examples here. So let's run through them. All right, so another attack that we could offer against utilitarianism would not appeal to the intuitive idea of justice, it would appeal to the intuitive idea of rights. And so again, the position of the utilitarian is something like only foreseeable consequences matter in determining right and wrong. And the critic says, oh, really? Not human rights? Violating human rights doesn't matter to you? Again, like I said before, even the rhetorical nature of that question is a partial victory for the critic in a way. I think it's maybe more apparent than actual, so we'll flesh it out a little bit more. But, in some sense, if the critic says human rights don't matter to you, what is the utilitarian going to say? Do you remember? It depends. I think famously, Jeremy Bentham has a line, I'll try to paraphrase here, that rights are nonsense on stilts, I think was the very strange phrase he used here. Now, it's a bizarre phrase to call rights nonsense on stilts, but if I try to understand that from a utilitarian perspective charitably, here's where Bentham is coming from, and this is going to do a little work for us intellectually in a moment here. Bentham is saying that rights are fictions, nonsense, on stilts that are raised up and kind of looked up to. They're noble fictions, okay? So keep that in mind from a utilitarian standpoint. And maybe those of you who are really, grasping this line of argumentation, you're going to see already where this is going. But let me do the critic a little bit more justice. And again, hearken back to James Rachel's writing on the debate over his preferred moral theory, utilitarianism. And he mentions, and he was the first one that ever drew my attention to this this case that actually ended up going to the United States Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals, about a woman named Angela York in California in the 1950s, I think around 1958, and the appeals, cases ran into I think actually the 60s. The incident happened in 58, and then the court cases ran into the 60s, early 60s. And so Miss Angela York in a city in California went to a police station to report an assault. Now, I don't know what kind of assault it was. Somehow in my mind, I've come to think that maybe it was even a sexual assault. But a woman came to a police station, Angela York came to a police station in 1958 to report an assault. Her case was given to a man named Ron Story. Officer Story took Miss York into a room, locked the door, and asked her to undress in order to photograph her injuries for evidence. Miss York objected and tried to argue. Mr. Officer Story insisted that this was important. Miss York, I believe, claimed that her injuries would not have even had time to show up yet. Mr. Story insisted. There were, I think, female officers present at the station. I believe that's correct, but none, maybe there was just one even, because it's 1950s police force. But none was brought in, nobody else was brought in to this locked room where Ron Story, in his capacity as an officer of the law, was insisting that for the processing of her case to move forward, Miss York needed to take off her clothes, and then he proceeded to have her pose in positions that he was claiming were showing her injuries and relevant to her case. All this must have been very upsetting to Miss York. Let's not waste a moment here blaming the victim on this one, okay, as to why she went along with it. She did, and the photos were made. However, the photos never made it into her case file. In fact, Officer Story claimed the photos didn't turn out when he attempted to develop them, and that's why they didn't happen. Okay, the photos did turn out, and they did eventually turn up in, can you guess where? In the possession of Ron Story and other members of the police force. And they were copied and distributed and copied again and distributed again. Now, this is a disturbing scenario, to say the least. Again, I think in this era of Me Too, it's particularly upsetting to many of us because we've had our consciousness raised in this regard. Just as I encouraged you a while ago to look back at our racial history, even in the middle and late 20th century, especially the 60s in the United States. If you want to have your consciousness raised, if you want to understand what some of your sisters are talking about here in this Me Too movement, look more carefully at the laws and the practices involving things like spousal rape in the 20th century in the United States. It is a shocker, and it will let you know a little bit of the important historical context for understanding later 20th century feminism and even 21st century Me Too activism. But in this case, it's upsetting to all of us, right, that have a conscience at all morally. And it seems on the surface of it, right, really intuitive what's wrong here. The very people that were in position to defend the rights of Miss York violated her rights. I think in the court case, what was discussed eventually were obviously her rights to privacy and also possibly kind of an illegal search of Miss York. That one, I forget how that played out in the court case. But again, intuitively, the very people that were there to protect Miss York's rights ended up violating her rights. And end of story, right? The critic of utilitarianism just says, period, end of story. We don't need to look further to understand what was wrong about what happened to Miss York. Okay, now let me pile on. The critic could go even further, right? And listen to the power of the rhetoric here. Are you, the utilitarian theorist, really going to do your calculus here? Are you really going to weigh the happiness or pleasure of Officer Story and all the other officers who ended up possessing these photos against the suffering of Miss York to decide right from wrong? Now, again, I'm going to let that question hang for a second because I think it is a pretty powerful victory for the critic. of utilitarianism, right? For the critic of utilitarianism, particularly if you're sympathetic to the idea of rights and that language is intuitive and appealing to you, this is an upsetting scenario. And the idea of a utilitarian weighing, even considering the happiness, the pleasures of Officer Story and the other officers involved in this case against the suffering of Miss York, already that is morally distasteful. It's kind of a reductio ad absurdum in and of itself, right? That we've followed this idea that only foreseeable consequences matter in terms of right and wrong. And so we weigh the foreseeable consequences. And here we're sort of looking back with perfect hindsight to say, really, you want to weigh the consequences here to decide right from wrong? Well, okay. I've let the power of the criticism, I hope, set in, but let's go to the defense to be fair, and let's look at the argument that the utilitarian might offer, and let's look at the two moves that we saw offered in the last argument about justice in the case of the racialized violence. First line of defense, challenge the scenario. Okay. And here, this isn't a fictionalized case like a Law and Order, TV show. This is literally ripped from the headlines. And that helps the utilitarian make the point. Look, if I'm looking at the foreseeable consequences, maybe I will, to use J.J.C. Smart's phrase, bite the bullet here. And yes, as despicable as it sounds, I will weigh the happiness of Mr. York and his colleagues against the suffering of Miss York and the entire community, when based upon what was foreseeable at that time and actual at this time, the suffering that they experienced because of these photos, which Mr. York and his colleagues could have easily gotten this kind of happiness from a magazine bought at the covered rack down at the store, right? They could have experienced this same kind of pleasure, very short term, very superficial, let's use Mill here, very low quality pleasure. They could have gotten this any number of ways. And yes, the utilitarian might bite the bullet and say, I will gladly weigh this limited, low quality pleasure that they could have gotten without hurting Miss York and without hurting the entire community. I will weigh that against the entirety of the community seeing its police officers violating a person in this way, and the suffering and the fear and the stress of Miss York and the entire community. Okay, I think as I even present the argument, this always seems to me like a kind of an impressive counterpunch. It was an impressive first punch, right, of the part of the critic, but it's an impressive counterpunch, a kind of a surprisingly impressive counterpunch. And now remember, we have the second level of defense in that philosophical jujitsu here in the MMA, martial metaphor that I'm using here of philosophy. And, pause for 1 second. Let me develop this and justify a little bit of my language, my martial language here. In some sense, as we pursue wisdom, we don't do ourselves justice when we just surround ourselves with people who agree with us. And so what we're looking for is disagreement. And what we're looking for is the strongest possible disagreement to test our ideas. And so you often get in debate and philosophical argumentation these kind of martial metaphors, these kind of almost violent sounding metaphors, and I hate to put it that way, but these kind of battle metaphors for the debate that goes on. Why? Because what we're trying to do is set up an idea for which we have no objective empirical facts. And so what do? Well, philosophically, what we do is we beat on the idea as hard as we can, and we see how well it withstands the attack. And if it withstands the attack well, it's a pretty good idea. If it falls too easily under the attack, then it's not a very good idea. And so here we've got utilitarian theory, and we've got a pretty darn good attack, and now we've seen a counter attack, a defense of the theory. And now we're going to add one more layer of defense here. And again, I think it's going to be a fairly powerful one. Remember Bentham's phrase, what did he call rights? Nonsense on stilts. Okay, from a modern crisis in ethics perspective, again, go back to my lecture on the modern crisis in ethics. If that doesn't work for you as shorthand at this point, right? We're trying to stand up on ideas that we developed earlier in this lecture in order to get further, earlier in this lecture series, in order to be able to think further and better and deeper. In the modern crisis in ethics context, what are the rights of Miss York that were violated? Now, I'm not trying to just be difficult here, and I'm not trying to blame the victim. I'm not trying to, stand up like a lawyer here and attack the victim. I'm trying to raise a very serious ethical or philosophical question about one of our key moral notions in the modern age, and that is the notion of the human right. And I want you to think about the notion of the maybe even natural human right, which is very much an echo, I would say, of natural law theory. Think of Jefferson and the connections that I drew between Aquinas, Locke, and Jefferson in my earlier lecture there. And now put this idea of the natural human right in the context of the modern crisis and look for the facts, look for the moral facts that justify our belief in the natural rights. Do the guys in Guantanamo, in the prison in Guantanamo Bay, have natural human rights? We talk a pretty good game in the 21st century about human rights, but I want to call us all out a little bit on this notion. We talk a pretty good game, but when you push us on who has these rights, we're often pretty quick to retreat to the idea of rights as a construction within certain cultural frameworks. And without falling all the way to cultural relativism, can we offer a modern defense of why we would put rights on stilts, why we would put rights on a pedestal, why rights would be an important moral concept, even in the context of the modern crisis in ethics? And I would say you probably can see where this line of reasoning is going. Ask yourself that intuitive question I used before. Where would you rather live, and why would you rather live in one of these two places? Where would you rather live in a society that has the rights to privacy and rights that protect you from unlawful search and seizure, or would you rather live in a society with no such rights? And now, if you answer the largely rhetorical question of, I think I'd rather have some rights, well, what and why? Is it possibly that you think you would be happier in the society with rights? So again, you see the philosophical jujitsu here. The theory of utilitarianism is beat up with a powerful moral concept called human rights. In a powerfully disturbing scenario like that of Miss York, the very people supposed to protect her rights, violated her rights. End of story. Well, is it end of story? The utilitarian says, actually, you may need something like my principle of utility to justify a rule like don't violate people's privacy. And again, the critics, even from within the utilitarian camp, who say, I don't like rule utilitarianism, again, I get it, what Smart is saying in some sense. Maybe this does ultimately collapse back into a form of act utilitarianism. And I'm going to go ahead and use this fairly sophisticated language to see if you can sort of level up and follow me here. In some sense, maybe, when we propose a rule, like we should have a right to privacy, and then we justify that rule by something like the principle of utility or the greatest happiness for the greatest number, maybe this collapses back to act utilitarianism, because sometimes there will be scenarios in which your privacy will be trumped by some other consideration, like security. Let's say after, this is problematic, but I'll just go here. After, 9/11, 2001, we trumped a lot of, ideas of privacy because of security. And in some sense, I'm going to I'll talk about this in a kind of a simple way to help utilitarianism, and then I'll give you a little bit more nuanced version of it, as I often do. You know, in some sense, what the utilitarian is going to say is, and that's exactly right, we have these rules that seem important because of utility, but guess what? They're not absolute. Why? Because it's the utility that matters. You know, why do we attempt to form a more perfect union if not to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number? And so occasionally we find a kind of, and I said before, you know, imagine you just add another rule. It's a rule about exceptions. And you got to make a really strong argument about when you're going to violate rights in order to, you know, serve the greater good. You know, again, I'll spell out some nuance here for those that are following. You know, in the case of 9/11, 2001, I think you could make a pretty good case that particularly the executive branch in that moment saw an opportunity where there was an awful lot of fear of insecurity to perhaps do a bit of a power grab with regard to privacy. And that should rightly be checked as we attempt to balance values, maybe all of which are ultimately generated by a kind of a respect for utility and the greatest happiness for the greatest number, values like security, values like privacy, values like liberty, right? Values like equality, right? So, you know, I know that case I brought up in terms of 9/11, 2001 was a little bit problematic. But let me go ahead and offer a couple other maybe that make the same utilitarian point. In the modern context, let's talk about public health. Let's talk about you coming from a situation of high breakout of a particular disease like COVID-19, and you're getting off the place in a place like New Zealand that has got no active cases. Well, guess what? They may want you to quarantine yourself. Now, in some sense, that may seem, even within the context of New Zealand's constitution, like a violation of your right to freedom. You know, and we often, again, talk a very good game of sort of ennobling these rights as your God-given right to freedom. But think about this in terms of a modern crisis and ethics perspective. Is this right absolute? Or in this moment, should we have a debate about how much, whether to, and to what extent to violate your right to freedom in order to serve what? Public health, the general welfare, greatest happiness, greatest number, utility. And so in some ways, I like to develop the argument out this way because even though a lot of utilitarians don't like rule utilitarianism, I actually think it's kind of a pretty strong argument for utilitarianism that it can be so convincingly used specifically in the context of rule utilitarianism with a kind of an exceptions clause to explain how we actually already do things in terms of our moral thinking. And there are a lot of other examples with regard to your right to property, your right to private property, including your right to bear arms, that I think obviously a kind of a more thorough and thoughtful analysis you would see you got a right. Why? Utility. Is it absolute? No. Why? Utility. Okay, now there's a third criticism here that I'm just going to sketch because you've already seen, I think, and wrestled with the structure of the argument. But the third possible attack, instead of appealing to rights or justice, appeals to something that Rachel calls backward-looking reasons. It says that, you know, some critics would say, look, the problem with utilitarianism is always looking at foreseeable consequences. Sometimes all you got to do is look backwards to see what's right and wrong. And by that, I think of a scenario like the case of giving your word to somebody. Is it right for me to keep my word? Well, what's relevant here? Well, some people would say, well, you gave your word, right? I mean, and that's the way we want to raise our children. You know, don't say you're going to do it if you're not going to do it. But as we become adults, no longer children, let's introduce the complexity that there are certain scenarios in which you give your word and then something comes up and my gosh, it's much more important than keeping your word in that moment. You know, here's my scenario I commonly use. If I told you I was going to promise I was going to help you study for an exam, and instead of meeting you, I didn't show up. Did I do you wrong? And, you know, I get a lot of students' heads nodding on that. Yeah, you did. Thanks for nothing. The exams are hard enough. And I say, well, wait a second. You're going to see an email from me eventually, because I sent it almost immediately as soon as I could. My daughter is seriously injured, and I had to take her to the emergency room. Now, who in their right mind is going to tell me that I've done something immoral by breaking my word to you in the scenario in which I had this other competing duty, and I had to weigh out, based on utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what was more important in this moment? And frankly, even if it wasn't my daughter, right? Even if it was a perfect stranger, I hope when you get the email that I was caught up in this scenario, and I'm going to do my best to make it right by you, but that I'm sorry, you know, I'm sorry I broke my word, but that you're not going to say, sorry, look backwards. You said you'd do it. You didn't do it. Morally wrong. You know, here the utilitarian case almost makes itself, right? What are obligations, and what are these sort of backward-looking reasons? If we can describe scenarios in which they're just so obviously not counterexamples, but they make sense of the utilitarian idea that it's about consequences, really. That's how we do it, and that's really when we get all the facts of the case. You know, to echo that Humean point, when we get all the facts of the case, we're going to be better able to judge the rightness and wrongness of the situation. And we understand the value even of such things as keeping promises in terms of utility. They make for trusting relationships, and trusting relationships are important. But, you know, my best friend is not going to call me immoral if I break my word to him or her in a scenario like the one I described. And that's, again, taking the argument to that kind of philosophical jiu-jitsu level of rule utilitarianism with an exceptions clause. Obligations matter, trust contracts matter, keeping your word matters, and yet there should be an exceptions clause. Okay, so that's the bulk of the criticisms. I do want to deal here with one more kind of criticism, and I'll develop it fairly quickly and then come back to it in my review of this lecture, because this is one of the most complex lectures so far. I wouldn't be surprised if it's going on longer than any other. It's a heck of an ask to follow this intellectually over time. But I hope really almost through sheer repetition that you know, it's really like breaking down a muscle. You're exhausting your mind, but the more you come back to this, the more you're able to come back to this, right? And what could be more important in terms of lifting our nation to a higher plateau, morally speaking, than getting more of us leveled up to a higher level of sophisticated, nuanced, complex, sustained discourse? Right? And so in some sense, the like literal exhaustion that we're dealing with intellectually and in terms of a complex long lecture is part of the work morally, I would argue. Certainly intellectually, and I'm arguing even morally, right? Okay, and that's my brief pep talk for you know, sticking it out for the last part of the lecture here. And so the last kind of attack of utilitarianism attacks that third basic claim that each sentient being matters. Okay, if you take that seriously, the critic says, you're going to end up with an incredibly disruptive set of moral duties. Now, let me spell that out in terms of what the criticism is here. If it's really the case that every sentient being matters to some degree, and even the weaker subset of that each person in the world counts morally for one, well, you're really going to disrupt my personal relationships. Okay, I give a lot of attention to my loved ones and my friends, and if every one of the billions of people around the globe matters just as much as them morally, what is that going to do to the way I treat and the special treatment I give to my friends and my loved ones? Okay, let me again sort of pile on from the standpoint of the critic. There's a famous criticism, and I'm going to forget off the top of my head who raised this point, but it's basically a scenario like, look, if you run into a burning building and you got your your child or your best friend, or your child and your best friend down this hall, and down here is somebody who is on the verge of curing cancer, are you supposed to turn your back on your child and your best friend in this burning building in order to morally go save the scientist on the verge of curing cancer? Okay, it's a pretty fictionalized thought experiment, but thought experiments are interesting, sort of seeing what matters here. And the critic is playing on our intuition that in some sense, you know, we have a duty to our children, you know, and we do, right? And we have maybe a duty to our loved ones to be there for them. And that the idea of the critic here is that you're kind of a moral monster to the extent that you turn your back on your child in order to save the cancer researcher. Okay, maybe, you know, again, I think the critics landed a blow of sorts here. It's disturbing to think about that kind of scenario. But let me begin to develop, you know, the counter. And the line of defense that's going to be offered here by the utilitarian is kind of an interesting one. Instead of, you know, foreseeable consequences, you know, and expanding on the counterexample and doing philosophical jujitsu with rule utilitarianism, I think in some sense, you know, echoing J.J.C. Smart in 1961 in his defense of utilitarianism, the answer is just basically like a big old tough. I'm sorry if you don't like it. I'm sorry if you don't like some of the implications of this theory, that it might disrupt your life in terms of the ways you treat your family and friends and disregard the well-being of strangers. And, you know, you can begin to build the case for that because, and this is, I think, something that Rachel's building on Smart does pretty well. You know, imagine that you make a bunch of money and you want to spend, you know, thousands of dollars on your daughter's quinceañera or your child's, you know, your daughter's sweet 16 or just a birthday party, you know, for your child. You know, isn't that your right? I mean, you made a bunch of money. Let's say you made it fairly and squarely, and now you want to spend it on your child. Okay. Well, look, I think in some sense it is your right, you know, especially from a political legal standpoint in many parts of the world. However, let's problematize that morally speaking just for a second, right? I mean, this is something Peter Singer does, I think, really effectively in some of his writings. He says, look, I'll do the research for you. Here is the number of several different international aid agencies that have a very reasonable overhead, and they could take $200 from you and change the life of a 5-year-old kid for a year in terms of food, in terms of medicine. Now, again, that maybe I'm stretching that, but again, it takes relatively little money to radically transform the life of a starving child over time. And let's put a point on this, right? If you don't meet the nutritional needs of children at a certain age, you are much more likely to produce somebody who's going to need help in the future rather than solve problems in the future, right? So from a utilitarian standpoint, do you have an argument to spend slightly less money on your child's birthday party in order to invest in the way in which children on the other side of the planet, or frankly, right down the road in any of our communities, might have their nutritional needs met at crucial stages of their development? And do you see how just sort of, even the just tough, you know, I think J.J.C. Smart says it as, you should question your common sense if you think that you have some moral right to spend all your money on yourself and your loved ones. Now, I'm not talking necessarily about an economic or political movement here. Let's just talk about private acts of charity, right? Just to sort of remove the muddiness that the words like socialism bring into the mix. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that, a lot of uncharitable rhetoric about that. But let's just remove it from the mix because it muddies the water. Do you have a moral duty, if you are relatively successful and to have all your basic needs met and beyond, to consider being more charitable. And again, you know, a lot of people want to make arguments about poor people deserve to be poor. I think that's really uncharitable and really unfair in a lot of ways. So a lot of times a common move in this argument is to say, okay, let's just talk about children under 5. You know, I forget the number off the top of my head, but it's roughly like 20-something thousand children under the age of 5 are going to die today of preventable causes. Let that sink in. 20,000 plus children under the age of 5 are going to die today around the world of preventable causes. A moment ago, we brought up 9/11, 2001 in the United States. 3,000 plus Americans died that day, and it was a huge tragedy and a horribly upsetting day for many of us who witnessed it and lived through it. And for the, I mean, gosh, hard to, you know, fathom the tragedy that was. And we changed the world in response to it. When I say the world, the United States of America changed, in some sense, the experience of people all over the world in response to the loss of 3,000 plus American lives. But now let's put some facts, some uncomfortable facts right next to each other. 9/11, 2001, 3,000 plus Americans died in a series of terrorist attacks and in fighting those, right, in the United Flight. And 9/11, 2001, 20-something thousand children under the age of 5 died from preventable causes on 9/12 and 9/13 and 9/14 and 9/15 and on every day since. And that number has fluctuated, right? And it's been as high as, say, 27, 28,000 kids a day, and it's been as low as close to 20,000. And you know what makes the difference? Effective charitable giving. And, you know, Singer, again, who is a utilitarian, makes this argument. And again, what am I doing? Let's back out, see the context here. The critic is saying that utilitarianism, in saying that every human matters and in saying every sentient being counts, is just describing a moral theory that is unrealistic, in particular in the way it disturbs our personal relationships. It's, you know, and the intuition has got to be something like those charitable acts are supererogatory. If you remember my lecture on social contract theory, if that's your intuition, fair enough. But the utilitarian does not believe that these acts are supererogatory, right? So Peter Singer has this incredibly powerful argument that I'll share with you where he says, look, if you're walking past a pond that is very shallow and a small child falls into the pond and is drowning, I don't care how late you are to your meeting. I don't care how expensive your shoes are. The right thing to do is obvious. It's not your kid, but you get the kid out of the pond, right? And the only difference between that kid drowning in that pond right in front of you and the 20-something thousand kids dying of preventable causes today around the globe is geographic location. And should that make the moral difference? Now, again, if you don't want to make this about people on the other side of the planet, make it about people in your community, right? Like, this doesn't have to be internationalized or globalized, because it could be made very real about people in your own community. And again, we keep it about children under 5 for the very obvious reason that you can't give that lame comeback of, you know, people without enough to eat just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work hard. You can't say that about kids born into abject poverty. And frankly, I think it's a pretty weak argument for a lot of people. A lot of the world's poor are the hardest working people you were ever met and ever meet. And many of them are frankly some of the most giving people you will ever meet. And if you've never visited, you know, communities that have been, you know, without economic development, then maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. And maybe we have a moral duty to visit such communities, right? To just sort of awaken our consciousnesses in this way. And frankly, maybe you're just that lucky that you've never been around communities like that, you know. But many of us have. And again, I'm relatively lucky, affluent, American, white, male, so lucky in many respects. to live in a relatively peaceful period of time with all kinds of economic privilege. And so I think it is at the very least, my moral duty to wrestle honestly with the historical context of racism, with the historical context of sexism, and with the history and actuality of those elements of society and poverty. And the way in which poverty is not always about somebody's bad choices. And if that's the case, then to what extent do I have a moral duty that is not just supererogatory, but is just my moral duty to consider effective charitable giving? And I'm going to use that word again, effective, right? Because people like to say, well, how do we know it won't be stolen or misused? Well, you do some research is how you know, right? Or you go there to your local community and you see it in action. And let's draw back up, a quote from Hume. Boy, if you want to bring, ironically, joy to your life, go to a community and see it in action, right? So, in some sense, the line of defense for the utilitarian is to just say, tough. I'm sorry if you don't like the implications of my theory. And here I'll pull from Rachel's some very effective rhetoric. We look back on the institutionalized racism of our earlier society with some moral guilt and shame, and I think that's right. We look back on institutionalized state-sanctioned sexism with moral guilt and shame, and I think that's right. Is it possible that we will look back on the throwaway, consumeristic, hedonistic culture of post-World War II United States with some guilt and shame at some point in the future? And let me leverage that to kind of expand this point. The critic here is going to say this is too demanding because not only does it impact my personal relationships, but you're making by saying each sentient creature matters, you are making the family barbecue a moral issue. You are making the purchase of a flat screen TV a moral issue. And the utilitarian response is to say, you're right. We are trying to make it a moral issue. There are moral issues involved in the family barbecue, and I'm sorry if that's disruptive to your life, but don't just turn a blind eye to factory farming. Now, I don't think that this argument leads in a direct line all the way to veganism. Some people do. I don't think it leads in a direct line even to vegetarianism. Some people do. I think, but remember what Mill said about the principle of utility. It's not an all or none. It's not black or white. It's a spectrum. So in some sense, there's an interesting opportunity for those of us who live in the late 20th, early 21st century to educate ourselves about how our food becomes our food, and then to go to the grocery store or wherever we get our food and to know how it got there and to vote morally with our dollars. And again, maybe there is a good argument from a utilitarian standpoint to be made that meat eating is causing too much suffering in the world. And yes, I've heard counter arguments from students in the past about what are you doing to the farmers, right, who raise these animals and don't treat them inhumanely. And that's why I wanted to say, I don't think that this is a black and white issue. I don't think that the only conclusion here is, close them all down. I think it does matter morally what our practices are with regard to how we raise our animals and how we slaughter our animals. I actually would like to introduce a kind of it'll sound controversial as an idea. I'm going to boldly predict that actually you're going to see this in your lifetimes if you're one of my students, younger students in particular. We are already making meat in labs. And if your first reaction to meat being made in labs is, ooh, oh, gross, you should look at factory farming, right? Like if you want to see, ooh, gross and be upset, then look at how relatively cheap meats become those relatively cheap meats in modern industrialized animal husbandry, where profit is the leading motive. And, you know, animal welfare is forced oftentimes through legislation, which is forced by moral consideration, right? So, you know, I think in some sense the utilitarian says, yeah, you're right. We are making the family barbecue and your meatloaf a moral issue. But look, it doesn't mean there's no place for meatloaf anymore. I think eventually you will see much cleaner, safer meat that was grown in culture in a lab that is atomically, molecularly the same thing and tastes just as good and involved no suffering and no, let's say, deforestation to create the grasslands to feed the cattle, and involved no cow burps and farts to create greenhouse gases. And you may laugh at that one, but it's no joke. There's all kinds of good reasons that are coming down the pipe at us, and I'll use that metaphor somewhat purposefully, to suggest that, yeah, the family meatloaf is a moral issue for all kinds of reasons. And the flat screen TV is a moral issue. You know, I may have mentioned in a much earlier lecture that our consumption of electronics in the first world, you know, drives some pretty awful things in elements of the developing and undeveloped world. You know, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, there's a much ignored, ongoing set of atrocities that are largely driven by getting a hold of the minerals that go into the electronics that we consume in the first world. And frankly, you know, from a utilitarian standpoint, here's part of that tough, sorry you don't like it, but here it is. You know, look at what is, I think, called marginal utility in economics, where, you know, if you upgrade from a, you know, and forgive me because I don't know my sizes of TVs, but if you go from a 60-inch TV to a 72-inch TV, you know, how much happiness do you add to your life? And if the price was right, you really could have changed a child under 5's life for 2 years or more. Is that worth considering morally? Are we going to look back on the patterns of consumption that were largely developed in the late 20th century in certain parts of the world, particularly the United States after World War II? Are we going to look back at those patterns of consumptions with some moral shame and guilt? And I just want to say, please be charitable here. I know it's disruptive. It's upsetting to me and much of my bourgeois lifestyle. I'm talking to you, you know, through computers and electronics. I get it. We're living examples of contradictions. But I feel like in some sense, part of the Socratic quest is to be willing to be uncomfortable in order to take ethical discourse to a higher level. And that's been my primary goal in this complex lecture today. I know it's tried our intellectual stamina, in part because I've also made arguments for intellectual stamina, not only as something that would benefit you in your life as a thinker, but maybe is even related to our moral lives as well. Not only in how to get the best out of life through intellectual development of the self, but almost in terms of how to be a better moral person, and because you can engage in more sophisticated, complex, sustained ethical discourse. And so I hope this wasn't too painful. I hope this will be an example of a pain that ends up having a longer term pleasure or happiness or tendency to add to your flourishing, and that flourishing might have an exponential effect in terms of how it might allow you to be a problem solver instead of a person that tends to turn away from such issues because they make us uncomfortable and they threaten our lives as we live them now. I do wish you that happiness.